Velkommen til Kloden drejer, her på Klimaradio. Vi undersøger ting og sager med betydning for klimasagen og sætter den i perspektiv. I dag laver Svend Linhus et interview med USA-eksperten Ben Dorfman fra Aalborg Universitet. Han fortæller om, hvordan man kan støtte klimasagen i USA under en præsident som Donald Trump, der hverken kan fordrage klimapolitik eller videnskab. Vi skal også høre om årsagen til, at klimapolitik er endt i en skyttegravskrig mellem de amerikanske partier. Mit navn er Vibe, og nu skal vi i gang.
I think we're ready to go. So Ben Dorfman, lecturer with the Institute for Culture and Learning at Aalborg University. I didn't really write an introduction about you, so could you please tell me a little bit about yourself and why you're in exile in Denmark?
Yeah, sure. Well, that had to do with some family issues. More than 15 years ago, after I finished my PhD, and at that time, my partner needed to return to Scandinavia to finish her studies, and so I went looking for work inside of around Scandinavia, and found my position at Aalborg. And for the most part, I've been teaching in the Language and International Studies program, and my primary research is on international human rights, but with a lot of intersection with how that lines up with the U.S. and international affairs. So I've got a kind of quasi-specialization going in the United States in international politics. So that sort of issue with a heavy human rights theme is my major focus as a researcher and instructor.
So you have, for a number of years now, watched the U.S. like the rest of us, sort of from the outside, but I suppose with a lot of contacts in the U.S., so you can get it internalized as well. So as a European who's been following American politics for a couple of decades now, mainly through YouTube, since November 9th, 2025, there's been one question lingering. How could it be that the American voters chose to pick Trump for a second term after the shipwreck he had of his first term? Your insights on that?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. The reality is that a lot of international issues are low on the American voters' priority list, and perceptions around the state of their economic life has had a high level of prioritization in terms of how Americans vote. There was a sense that the economy did well under Trump, at least up until COVID kicked in, and there was also very much a sense that people were somehow struggling economically, and that had a lot to do with Trump's return to power. But on the other hand, I know for a lot of Europeans and also for not a small number of Americans, there's a sort of concrete question of how somebody who tried to undo American democracy could land it back in the White House. And the reality is that the United States is caught in an enormously deep culture war at the moment, where there are, in essence, two different sides of the country that are in almost open warfare with each other about values, about representation, about whether or not the common person is seen in the context of government. And that drives an enormous amount of the activity around Trump at the political level.
Yeah. It looks like the climate agenda is facing stiff opposition in the US, despite the fact that we have been talking about this for decades. Scientists are mostly in agreement. Hurricanes, flooding, and wildfires are becoming more frequent and destructive. Still, America's backpedaling, and it seems to be living in denial. Is it due to a threat to the American way of life? Is it the conservative and religious wave that causes magical thinking? Is it corporate media, corporate lobbying, or all of the above?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different factors. And of course, it depends also on which America you're talking about. So, of course, the United States also has a history of important activism around climate change, dating all the way back to things like the foundation of the Sierra Club and John Muir, and many of the kind of writings which emerged at the end of the 19th and beginning of the early 20th century that set the tone for international environmentalism. And of course, Rachel Carson was American, and her, seminal work, Silent Spring, also came out of a kind of American intellectual milieu that intersected with the natural sciences in the 50s and 60s. But on the other hand, I would say that climate politics in the US has become deeply wound up in the culture wars which have defined the 21st century of American politics, where there is a war of values going on between two Americas, each claiming to sort of be left out of America. And one of those Americas is a deeply conservative, deeply religious America, which claims that it's not seen, and that its ability to lead its sort of traditional way of life has somehow been pushed out by intellectuals from the coasts who also hold the value of trying to combat climate change. So I would say that one of the issues that goes with climate denialism, and I can tell you, for example, I don't have the most recent polling, but I sometimes use a 2017 University of Chicago poll and some of the things that I write from time to time. And 90% of Democrats are very clear that climate change is taking place and identify themselves with the move to try to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. But 25% of Republicans don't. But that's also a change. And that change has a lot to do with precisely this idea that climate change is an issue for elite intellectuals, and that somehow it represents a war against the common man. And that is the calling card of populist politics on the right in the US in the 21st century.
Do you think it's possible to actually affect how climate politics is viewed with the Americans who primarily get their information from medias that are opposed to climate change science? Are there any ways to kind of inform them otherwise?
I mean, this is an enormous. Again, this split in American society is in fact massive. So what I can tell you is that I'm an American passport holder myself. Even though I've been sort of in the Eurosphere now for a couple of decades, I still am in the States very frequently. I've had periods where I've been living back there for shorter time and so on and so forth. So able to sort of look at both worlds and American society is just enormously split. The world I grew up in, education levels were high. People were readers of the New York Times, and was very much the kind of, I guess, intellectual America, which is relatively heavily under attack right now by populist forces, which exists in a whole other sphere in terms of where information is coming from, which is what you're pointing to, and you're correct about that. And so I would say that the issue is not Americans as such not getting their information from good sources. It's that there is an enormous lack about where to go to get valid information about almost anything. And so this cultural split comes along with a media and information source split, where you have a good chunk of Americans, New York Times or the Los Angeles Times, or listening to national public radio, or looking at public television, or somewhat more progressively, intellectually minded news outlets. And then you have another part of the United States which thinks that this is mainstream media, which is in essence against them, or not telling us certain sets of truths, and that there's a kind of that they're somehow connected to a sort of network of intellectuals, which plays into this idea that there is a deep state which is somehow out to control us. And again, the climate discourse is brought into the spectrum of that thinking. And so you have a deep split in American society in terms of what is considered a valid information source, and whether or not truth is really to be found in mainstream information sources, or if one needs to go to alternative information sources which tell us the real truth behind the scenes. But as we have found out sometimes, for example, vis-a-vis COVID or vis-a-vis election conspiracy theories in the US, this has not been the real truth behind the scenes. This has been a manufactured truth, actually.
Yeah, and of course, in that respect, you can also blame the social media algorithms that actually, favor engagement over actual truth and moderation, and gives you more of what you already seek. So you live in an echo chamber, so you get a kind of your own reality to fit with your general worldview.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I've also, again, I can't give you the exact numbers, but the Pew Research Center does a lot of polling on all sorts of different social and political and cultural issues in the U.S. and American society. And I was looking recently at a poll that they had taken, and large portions of Trump's voters are getting their basic news information from social media and not from journalistic news sources. And one sees this reflected in the Trump White House. They have opened up, in essence, what are varieties of kind of social media reporters to, in some cases, start to take the place a little bit of the mainstream journalistic outfits. And this is a reflection and also plays into this division in terms of flows of information.
You went briefly around religion, because there's a lot of religious influence in the U.S. and it has always been, but it seems like it's been growing over the past decades. And is that because there's a population shift in the U.S. where actually religious families are well known for having more children?
So actually, the
So
reality
is there
that
a shift in the population towards religious groupings? What's it about?
So there is sometimes a tension or contradiction between the fact that the religious right, the evangelical right in the U.S. is so vocal politically, and actually the fact that the country is experiencing a decline in terms of things like church attendance or people identifying themselves as religious. But there's also a longer term trend that you're pointing to, which is true, which is that America has an enormously long tradition of being home to a massive diversity of religious minorities. And in terms of the evangelical movement, that includes dissenting religions that often came from Europe to the United States to find places where they could practice religion freely. This has resulted in there being a large presence of charismatic movements in the American religious spectrum, which tend towards a relatively high level of cultural conservatism and sometimes literalist readings of the Bible, where there actually can be a kind of doubt of basic science in relation to a lot of different issues. This is not an enormously large population, but its political voice might be louder than the actual size of the group, so to speak. And again, I know I keep using this culture war vocabulary, but it just has an enormous amount of meaning in relation to so many political developments in the U.S. And this is, again, this idea of what does it mean to have an alternative view of the world, of science, of truth, I guess, from what's academically sanctioned or what's considered mainstream, and that becoming a sort of site of a kind of symbolic battle. So in that way, doubting climate change, having ideas that are skeptical towards kind of university-generated science is brought into the orbit and collection of a lot of sensibilities of somehow having been pushed to the outside in American society. And Trump and the Trump movement have fed enormously much off of that sensibility and that tendency. And you've heard this in this vocabularies that somehow Trump is the revenge or the retribution for decades of conservative Americans, from their perspective, being shoved off to the side by liberals. So there is a willingness among his hardcore supporters anyway to allow for this kind of vengeance against basic climate legislation. which is partly what you were getting at, and the repeal of all sorts of very basic things, not the least of which is, for example, the 2009 finding of the Obama administration that greenhouse gas is a fundamental danger to the American environment as well as the global environment. And that has been the basis of a lot of fundamental moves at the legislative level in the US, such as, putting limitations on the emissions from cars, factories. And with the repeal of that act, Trump has taken away that fundament. So that's extremely dangerous.
Okay, so it's clear that the current administration has no interest in avoiding climate change. Trump withdrew the US from the Paris Climate Accord, revoking the Clean Air Act, promoting clean coal, whatever that is, and ramping up oil production. But it seems like there's a lot of businesses and state and local actors who see the future differently and act accordingly. Can you point to some of those and how they try to navigate this hostile political environment?
Yeah, so with my expertise, not being directly in sort of climate science and climate issues and climate policy, I can only speak in generalistic terms. But what I can tell you is that for sure there is a distinction between the discourse of the Trump government at the federal level, both in Trump government 1 and even more so in Trump government 2, and then different states and localities around the country. For example, in addition to my residency in Europe, I also have residency still in the US. That's actually in Oregon, in the Portland area. And there, the state and the city take very different kinds of initiatives. So building bike paths, passing legislation to have electric buses and zero emission buses, in carpool lanes, local ordinances oriented towards recycling and economic incentives for businesses to be using green products. These are things that states and municipalities or cities still have the ability to put into place, and they do. And so there is a big distinction between some of the orders coming out of the Trump government and what liberal cities from Portland to Seattle to New York try to do at the more local level around climate policy and climate change. And you can also see, of course, too, that, states send representations to international organizations and meetings. So Gavin Newsom in California shows up at things like the World Economic Forum. He tries to make his voice heard in fora where climate is in discussion, and to at least have it be understood that Trump does not represent all of the United States in this regard, and that state actors and local actors are also willing to try to affect positive change at those levels.
A lot of the energy transition tech is actually being developed in the US. Do you see a future where the economy and employment in that sector become so big and the cost of renewables so low that oil and gas aren't really relevant anymore, even for political purposes, even in the states like Texas?
This is a good question. So there again, you would need a little bit more of an expert in energy solutions and energy issues than I am. What I would say, though, is that we are again at a point where there's a ferocious battle around this. So, the Biden administration, the Obama administration too, tried to take some serious steps towards licensing wind and solar projects, towards at least discursively putting investment in green technologies and the Green New Deal more at the center of the American economy. The Biden administration, I know, also was very strategic in where it granted federal subsidies for the development of things like wind farms and solars, and it often did that in red states with the idea of trying to make it more difficult to get that stuff out. In other words, that if Trump started repealing initiatives across the country, which he's been trying to do, that would get some pushback from congressional representatives in red states, in part because those technologies were providing employment to people in their districts. I'm a little bit unsure of where that is right now. I know, and I can't tell you the cases off the top of my head, but I know that I've heard of a couple of instances where vis-a-vis a federal order, Trump has said that he wanted to roll back Project A, B, or C. And in fact, there has come some pushback from Republicans about that precisely for this reason, that this would mean a loss of some hundreds of jobs in a district or something along those lines. But on the other hand, Trump has also managed to shut down some seriously large projects having to do with offshore wind farms and some of these sorts of things. And so it's a battle right now. It's a flat out battle. But what I would agree with you is that, Biden was taking this approach that you're mentioning, which is trying to integrate, the green transition so deeply into the American economy that it would be hard to get out. And he had some success with that. There was a level of success with that, but he would have needed a second term to go as far as he wanted. And so the question becomes, in a post-Trump world, is somebody able to re-engage that process that the Biden government had started?
Okay. So let's turn to climate NGOs. Do you have any knowledge about any climate NGOs like 350.org, Citizens Climate Lobby, Sunrise Movement, or how they work and how we might be able to support them from over here?
Well, so this is not my big area of expertise. There are, of course, scholars who work in this kind of area. What I can say, of course, is that there is still open space in American media culture. The reality is that the Congress is, even though it is Republican majority at the moment, that's just barely. So there are plenty of political representatives who are open to hearing from the interests of climate activist organizations, that it's still possible to operate with free speech in American public space. So the representation of climate interests in terms of expression on the street and activism in public is still there and still present. And it's important that be kept up such that people don't have the imagination that the issue of climate change has completely disappeared from the American public space, because it hasn't. And all the different organizations that you point to, individual activists, citizens groups, they're still present for sure. And one of the things that Trump is attempting to do, and his movement is attempting to do, is they're in some ways attempting to create a kind of social situation in which we are able to forget that there are tens of millions of Americans who are active in NGOs that have to do with climate change and civil society organizations, and who do see this as an important issue, and who want, the development of climate-friendly technologies to continue. Everything from solar and wind to better building materials for houses, and how construction is done, green thinking around projects in cities. And what Trump is largely, and his movement are largely trying to do, is create such an oppressive situation towards the idea of climate change that we sort of forget that there are people who support positive initiatives in these areas. And so I guess what I would respond, without being a complete expert in the range of organizations that there are in the States, is I would say that their continued activism remains important in terms of fighting this battle to make sure that both other Americans and the rest of the world recognizes that there are large parts of American society that still do see this as an incredibly meaningful and important issue.
So maybe they are taking the approach right now that instead of trying to move policy upwards to a national level, maybe they, as some organizations in Denmark do, actually just do grassroots work, like local work, planting forests, stuff like that. Would that be the most economical way to actually approach it right now, to do stuff at the local level and forget about climate policy on the federal level?
So offhand, looking at the political landscape in the States right now, I would say that these are the bigger openings for civil society organizations that are putting climate at the top of putting the climate at the top of their agenda. I think they're going to find much more sympathy at local and state levels than they are at the federal level at the moment, where in essence there's no interest at the federal level in this issue anymore.
So over the last year, Trump has been wreaking havoc with a lot of different issues. And actually, as we are taping this, it's less than 48 hours since he started a war with Iran, apparently because he needed a very big diversion from the Epstein files. But that's not much the gist of my question right now. The main resistance to what he's actually doing is the judicial system. Every kind of judge in the US are actually outlawing a lot of his actions, whether it's his own Trump-appointed judges or if it's Biden, if it's Bush-appointed. They tend to follow the law and kind of hamper his actions in a lot of ways. How big an influence do you think the judicial system would have on his climate policy?
Sure. So I think what you point to is correct to a degree. I mean, in that there are rulings from different levels inside the judicial system which have thrown into question a lot of Trump's executive orders and actions. But the Supreme Court, with the exception of this last ruling on tariffs, has actually been relatively supportive of most of Trump's executive orders. And so there's a little bit of a conflict between levels vis-a-vis the judicial system in the US right now, as concerns Trump's approach to a lot of different things. That ruling about tariffs was, of course, important because it demonstrated that there is still independence for the judiciary in the US. And this may also become extremely important if Trump gets involved in another set of legal challenges to either the midterm elections or potentially the 2028 election, or even more extreme, and I think unlikely, but potentially his ability to, say, be in office for a third term. But I don't see the Supreme Court, and this is, of course, the million-dollar question, because every legal case in the US has the potential to end up at the Supreme Court. There is very simply a relatively heavy conservative majority on the Supreme Court right now that I would not imagine is going to be automatically friendly to the idea of the necessity of climate legislation. So I don't see this as a Supreme Court which is friendly to a climate-friendly agenda.
Still some view, specifically the ruling on tariffs, and also in other cases recently, as a kind of a shift that actually the Supreme Court recognizes that maybe they've gone a bit too far and they are growing weary of Trump because of all his antics and because his lawlessness. So maybe actually this signifies a kind of a shift in their attitude toward him, that they would actually vote him down more times than not in the future.
Well, that they've maintained some level of independence has meaning. And, in terms of the electoral system and the political system, the midterms coming up in November also has a lot of meaning. So if Democrats are able to retake at least the House, the lower of the two chambers of the American Congress, that could put the brakes on some of Trump's agenda, or at least throw things into a kind of gridlock. I mean, as you and most observers know right now, I mean, the road is just simply sort of paved for Trump to do largely what he likes, because a Republican-dominated Congress is just in essence saying that whatever you're ordering out of the White House, we're either not willing to oppose it, or we will support it simply. And you're pointing to something which is generally correct, which is that if Americans want to have some level of real effective legal opposition to Trump, then the levers of government have to be used for that, and the American system of checks and balances has to be used for that.
Maybe also the Supreme Court can acknowledge that Trump's polling currently is pretty bad and has been for a long time. So they kind of know what way the wind is blowing. Do you think they're affected by that?
Well, they're not supposed to be. And in a certain way, I hope that they're not. So the Supreme Court is not supposed to be reading opinion polls and making decisions based on whether or not a policy is popular. They are supposed to be doing it based on objective readings of the basic laws of the United States and the Constitution most fundamentally. And there is a very conservative court at the moment because it has a big chunk of Trump appointees in addition to different Bush appointees. So the number of Democratic appointed members of the court is small. It's only 3 at the moment. So I don't think that, again, I don't think that there's going to be a lot of sympathy towards a lot of, if the White House is saying that it wants to deregulate, I think that's going to find support among the court's 6 conservative members. It is up to Congress to put in laws into place if it would like to put the brakes on this level of deregulation around climate initiatives. And that is going to demand a different constitution in terms of membership in the Congress than there is now.
I guess we'll have to wait 3 years for that to actually happen, unless Trump totally dismantles the American democratic system and actually manages to federalize elections so he can control it and stay in power. But do you fear that?
Yes, of course. Yeah, for sure. And, this is a little bit the issue, which is that there are some perspectives, and they are legitimate, which would say that, there are certain limits in which he's not going to be able to go past. On the other hand, we have seen him do things that have just been unthinkable. And to me, the most unthinkable among them is January 6th in 2021. And also the vast level of falsehoods that are circulated out of the White House on a regular basis, which just exceeds anything else we've seen. I mean, we've struggled with this issue in relation to all White Houses, and there were all sorts of non-truths told around the Iraq War and other issues like that. But this is another level of, this is another amount, I guess I would say, that we haven't seen before. And so one cannot 100% say that there will not be a fundamental crisis vis-a-vis the electoral system or the question of the constitutional right to stay in power.
In the worst case scenario, if the democratic system in the US ends up being dismantled, would there be no more climate policy? Will it be just oil and gas and coal and pollution until the whole thing is ruined?
I think if Trump were to have his way, it could look like that. I mean, so very telling is that he has given an executive order to the Pentagon to get more of their energy from coal than they have in the past, which is somehow unthinkable given the fact that the global scientific community is in near 100% consensus on the idea that coal emissions are wildly damaging. And of course, were developed technologies over the years to mitigate some of that, but there is no climate scientist that I know of which is pointing to coal as the future of clean energy. So again, this is a cultural statement that somehow the whole world and the United States is supposed to turn the clock back to the early 1950s, which is unrealistic and potentially harmful. And not potentially harmful, but potentially radically harmful in an immediate sense. So again, I think that and obviously we're all clear about the role that the United States plays in all this. So even though the U.S. has less than a quarter of China's population, actually China's not even the most populous country in the world anymore. It's India now, as most of us know. It still remains the largest economy in the world, and Americans per capita have an enormous CO2 output, right? We leave a very large carbon footprint. Again, I don't have the statistics available right here, but I was comparing how much the average American uses CO2 versus average Dane, for example, and I seem to remember it's at least 33% more, if not double. So what the United States does has vast meaning here. There's no question about that. Again, it also plays into all of the other issues, which is that the United States is, under Trump, especially in his second term, is so willing to step outside of a kind of attempts to find consensus among larger modern democratic nations on any issue. And that all of a sudden countries from Germany to Denmark to France, the traditional European allies, are no longer seen as sort of brothers and sisters in spirit anymore, and potentially even seen as a problem or an enemy. And the climate issue gets drawn into this as well, that sort of by and large, countries inside the European Union, by hook and by crook, I mean, I realize that there's a diversity of perspectives and sets of policies in play, but there is an attempt for Europe to be on the good side of the climate issue right now. And in essence, Trump's America, or the Trump government, that's one of the things that it's pointing its finger at Europe about. It's too woke and it's too green. And these things are seen as connected to each other somehow. And the question that we have is, can America find a return to being part of a kind of consensus among modern thinking democratic countries about the way forward on a range of issues, from the climate to democracy to peace and stability. And in fact, actually, you can make the argument that those things are interconnected issues.
And also the question is if in the near and a bit further future, if the American influence over the world actually will wane and the American economy actually will shrink, because right now it seems like the rest of the world is moving on with both energy transition and climate policy, and they are making alliances left and right around the US, which might actually cause the US to be quite isolated and maybe left behind while the rest of the world moves on. How do you see that?
You know, Mark Carney pointed at this possibility when he spoke at the World Economic Forum, that, sort of a world of kind of what one might think of as sort of middle rank nations or democracies might find common cause with each other. I think that there's a lot of potential in that idea if the United States is sort of forever lost in this direction. European Union countries, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, sort of modern democracies that have a fair amount of economic weight. Denmark would be among these. Even though it's a small country, it punches above its weight in terms of international significance, for sure. And Denmark, that's a kind of coalition that Denmark would want to find itself in, a kind of sort of international liberosphere, so to speak, that would be oriented towards science-based policy on climate issues, and would be trying to integrate positive action around climate change into productive economics as well. And so much weighs on whether or not America is really represented by Trump and his movement, or if that really is a kind of minority movement ultimately. And that question is still open. It's still an open question at this point. And I think that, again, as you pointed to, the final answer to that will not be seen, unfortunately, until the question comes whether or not to continue the Trump movement after Trump, or whether or not the Trump movement stops with Trump leaving office, which we presume that he'll be doing in 3 years.
Yeah. So you find that there's a hope for a better future where the US gets back on track with climate policy and energy transition?
So the potential is there. I mean, Trump is so dominant that we still do have to remember that 3 of the last 5 administrations in the US have been Democrats and have been involved presidents that have had, relatively speaking, climate-friendly perspectives. And we, again, also do have to remember that even though Trump did win the popular vote this last time, barely. I mean, that was by like 1.7%. So there is just a gigantic portion of America which is clearly on the side of this kind of internationalism and trying to lead and be part of a broader sort of coalition of modern democracies attempting to affect positive change on this front. But it is very much in the balance right now, and it's difficult to say what is going to tip this. One trend in the American society, which is a bit concerning from the last election, is how many young people started to vote for Trump this past time around. I think no matter where we are in the world, we often think of the climate movement as being inordinately young, that it belongs to a younger generation of citizens. And I think that there's a lot of evidence for this. And I think in Europe, that is largely the case, too. I think that remains the case very much in Europe. Somehow there is a permission structure which has emerged in the US, which is allowing younger people to move from left to right in American society. And with that, is a larger portion of young people which are skeptical towards a lot of initiatives around climate change. I would say that this is still, and evidence would show that this is still not a majority by any means among, say, voters under 35. But that tendency would also have to stop at some level. We wouldn't want to see more slide in that direction. That would further the forces that are out to deregulate and fight against the fight against climate change, so to speak.
Okay, I was hoping we could end on a hopeful note, but I guess we will have to end with the famous words of Bob Dylan. The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind.
Yes, it is. I would say the wind. We're needing to much wait and see which way the winds are going to blow, because currently in American society, I would say they're blowing in two different directions simultaneously.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Svend. I enjoyed speaking with you.
Yeah, you too. Have a nice day.
Enjoy.
Tak fordi du lyttede til denne episode af Kloden drejer. Vores mål er at give dig ny viden og nye vinkler på klimakrisen. Vi vil også gerne give dig inspiration til selv at finde flere løsninger på den. Kloden drejer udgives af Klimaradio. Trods navnet er det ikke en radiostation, men podcastafdelingen af Klima-TV. Begge dele støttes af netværket Klimahop. Du kan finde flere episoder af Kloden drejer på platformen årsagen, ausha.ch eller på hjemmesiden klimatv.dk. Her finder du også mere information om Ben Dorfmans arbejde og klimasagen i USA. Svend Linhus har lavet dagens interview. Rasmus Skov Larsen har klippet og tilrettelagt episoden. Mit navn er Vibe. Vi høres ved.